It all started with an idiotic bet my husband Zeca made and ended with the sweet taste of my own freedom on my lips. That Sunday, I was just Zeca's wife, another ornament by the pool, ignored amidst the smell of grilling meat and the repetitive pagode music, until he decided to show me off like a trophy, including me as the prize in a ridiculous wager. But he made a mistake. He thought he was humiliating me, when in fact, he was setting me free. One look, one silent invitation, and I accepted. What came next wasn't about betrayal. It was about rediscovering my own desire, my own name. While he snored on the couch, I knocked on door 202, unafraid to cross that threshold. You want to know what I found on the other side? Then sit down, because now the story is mine. The Sunday was a lukewarm soup of mediocrity. The greasy smell of picanha clung to the humid air, mingling with the pool's chlorine and the cheap perfume of one of Zeca's friends' wives. The pagode spilling from the portable speaker felt like the soundtrack to our marriage. The same beat, the same lyrics about a love gone wrong, repeating on a loop until it lost all meaning. And there I was, an ornament by the pool, feeling the sun cook my skin as the men's gazes passed over me without ever truly seeing me. I was Zeca's wife, an accessory, part of the landscape, especially to Ricardo, the neighbor whose wife, Claudia, guarded him like a fragile trophy, monitoring his every move. I'd felt his eyes on me sometimes, quick, almost accidental glances, until the accident became real. My husband's drunk, slurred voice ripped through the air. He pointed in their direction, his arrogance turned up to full volume. I'll bet a case of picanha that my wife, if she wanted to, could make you forget your own name. The music seemed to choke. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and for me, delicious. The humiliation of being treated like a prize lasted only a second. What came after was a spark, an electric current that brought me back to life. For the first time in years, I wasn't the landscape. I was the main event. He came toward me, the trophy in his hands, which, in this case, was me. Zeca walked with the swagger of a victorious general, the stench of beer and poorly digested meat arriving before he did. His eyes gleamed, not with desire for me, but with triumph over the other men. He leaned in, his body heat sticky and unpleasant. "Show that hen Claudia who's boss," he whispered, his voice pasty, his possessive hand squeezing my arm with unnecessary force. "Go on, tease little Ricardo, just so I can rub it in her face later." Every word was another nail in the coffin of what we once were. He thought he was giving me an order, using me like a pawn in his little macho game, a doll for his amusement. But what he actually did was something else entirely. In that instant, looking at the stupid grin on his sweaty face, I understood everything. He wasn't locking me in. He had just unlocked a cage, never realizing the beast inside was starving. And he'd handed me the key. The bet was his, but the victory would be mine, and the prize wouldn't be a bleeding piece of meat on a cutting board. The prize would be my own will, my own game. The look I gave him back wasn't one of obedience. It was cold, calculated. It was the look of someone who has just been handed a loaded gun and is dying to test the trigger, aiming at everything and everyone that kept her captive. Before I even moved a muscle to stand, I let my eyes make the first move, the first provocation. They swept across the barbecue area, past familiar faces and empty laughter, ignoring the mediocre stage Zeca had set. My eyes had a single destination, and they found it. Ricardo. He was visibly uncomfortable, tense beside Claudia, who seemed to be whispering poison in his ear. He gripped his glass tightly, his jaw clenched. But then he saw me. And in the second our gazes met, the universe of that pathetic barbecue shrank and focused on just the two of us. His discomfort didn't vanish, but it transformed. There was a question in his eyes, a curiosity that burned hotter than the coals on the grill, going far beyond the stupid bet. And I answered, without words, without a smile, just with a subtle raise of an eyebrow. It was a pact, a contract signed from 20 yards away over the sound of the pagode. "Shall we play?" his eyes seemed to ask. "The game has already begun," my eyebrow replied. Zeca, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't see it. Claudia, blinded by jealousy, didn't understand. But we both knew. This was no longer about them. It was already about us. Adrenaline began to pulse through my veins, a good poison, waking me up. I was no longer playing a part for my husband. I was on my way to meet my accomplice. Getting up from the chair was like stepping onto a stage at the start of a show. I felt the weight of every gaze on me, a collective, unwanted caress, except for one. Every muscle in my body felt conscious, alive. The hot sun on my back was a spotlight. The cool, uneven stone beneath my bare feet reminded me where I was stepping, on dangerous ground. I began to walk, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a walk. It was a procession. Each step, a silent provocation. I could feel Zeca's grin on my back, the idiotic pride of a man who thinks the performance is for him. I could also feel Claudia's hatred, a dense wave of heat coming my way, so palpable I could almost touch it. I ignored them both. They were just the audience. My destination was the man by the fire. As I got closer, the heat from the grill hit me like a warning, a reminder of the danger I was seeking. Ricardo didn't move. He just waited for me, the spatula still in his hand. The smoke from the meat rose between us, creating a haze, a perfect veil for what was to come. The noise of the party, the music, the conversations, all of it seemed to fade, receding into the background, leaving only the two of us and the sizzle of meat on the grill. An intimate, raw sound. The sizzle of the meat was the only soundtrack to our silence. I broke the unspoken pact, my voice huskier than I'd intended, nervousness scratching at my throat. "I think you owe me a beer for that bet," I said, the words hanging in the smoke between us. He looked at me for a long moment, a look that measured me. Then, a half-smile formed, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They remained serious, fixed on mine. "I think your husband owes me a picana." He turned, grabbed a cold, sweating bottle, and handed it to me. It was all calculated. Our fingers touched, and it wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate pressure, skin on skin, an electric shock that shot up my arm and confirmed everything. I moved closer, invading his space as if to tell an innocent secret. "And you?" I whispered near his ear, breathing in the scent of his skin, a mix of smoke and something else, something that was just him. "What do you think I owe you?" His reply came in the same tone, a warm, unexpected breath on the back of my neck that made me shiver. "The bet is just an excuse. Meet me at my apartment later. We'll decide on the real prize then." The offer was made, direct, raw. In that instant, Zeca's childish little game had just died, and ours, dangerous and adult, had just been born. I stepped back from him with the slow grace of someone savoring a secret, the warmth of his breath still on my skin, his promise echoing in my mind. It drew a smile on my lips that wasn't for anyone but me. I glanced at the audience, and the scene was exactly as I'd imagined. Zeca was beaming, raising his beer glass to me in a loud toast, his chest puffed out with cheap pride. Beside him, Claudia looked ready to explode, her face a mask of contained rage, her eyes shooting daggers at me, promising a war she didn't even know she had already lost. I had given my husband the public victory his fragile masculinity so desperately needed. So I played my part, giving him a gesture of a docile, obedient wife, with the sweetest smile I could muster. It was my finest performance. Then my eyes returned to my true accomplice. Ricardo was watching me, impassive. He raised his eyebrow, the same silent question as before, but now it carried a different weight. "Are you coming?" I answered with an almost imperceptible nod. A yes that only he, in the entire universe, could understand. The promise was sealed. I had won the battle for my husband, but I had just declared my own war. The feeling was one of absolute power, of holding all their fates in the palm of my hand, and the night was just beginning. The end of the barbecue was a blur of fake goodbyes and tense smiles, a theater of appearances I couldn't wait to be over. Claudia practically dragged Ricardo away by the arm, but not before he cast one last look over his shoulder at me, a look that was an anchor, a silent promise. "I'll be waiting." An hour later, the house was a graveyard of dirty dishes and empty bottles. The stale smell of a finished party clung to everything. Zeca was snoring on the sofa, a trail of drool at the corner of his mouth, reeking of sour beer. He was the very picture of his pathetic victory, a king asleep on his throne of mediocrity. Looking at him there, so oblivious, so satisfied with so little, dissolved any trace of guilt I might have felt. I grabbed my purse. The keys in my hand felt heavy. The metallic sound they made in the silence was like a bell tolling for my freedom. I leaned over his sleeping body. "Going to the pharmacy," I murmured to no one. The lie flowed like water, easy and natural. Leaving my own apartment felt like escaping a prison. The silent hallway, lit by a cold, impersonal light, was death row for the woman I used to be. My heart was pounding in my throat, a drumbeat announcing the danger. Each step toward door 202 was a step away from everything I knew, a step toward a cliff I desperately wanted to leap from. I stopped in front of his door. The number 202 seemed to stare back at me. I took a deep breath. The cold air in the hall couldn't extinguish the fire consuming me from within. I raised my hand and knocked. Once, twice. The sound was like thunder in the silence of the building. Too loud, too final. The seconds I waited felt like an eternity. Then the door opened. He had showered. His hair was damp, and the smell of soap had replaced the smell of smoke and barbecue. He said nothing. His eyes said everything. He just stepped aside, a silent invitation. Walking into his apartment was like diving into deep water. The air was different. The light was different. There was none of the familiar, chaotic mess of my home, but an impersonal, minimalist order that made me even more aware of what I was doing there. There were no distractions, just us. He closed the door, and the sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was a full stop. There was no going back. The silence that settled between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy, dense, filled with everything the bet had stirred up. We stood there, two strangers brought together by a drunkard's boast, about to make either a terrible mistake or the best decision of our lives. The silence was so heavy I could feel its weight on my shoulders. It was his deep voice that cut through it. "So," he said, without moving, "did you come to collect on the bet?" The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, stripped of any games. I lifted my chin, and the words came from a place inside me I didn't know existed. "I came to collect the prize," I answered, and the courage in my own voice surprised me, set me on fire. There were no more words. They weren't necessary. What happened next wasn't about love or some overwhelming passion. It was about power. It was about him looking at me as an equal, an accomplice, not as another man's property. It was about breaking the rules of a game we didn't choose to play. Every touch was an affirmation of my own will. Every kiss, an act of rebellion against the monotony, against the contempt. It was my way of tearing up the invisible contract of being Zeca's wife. In that silent apartment, while my husband snored, dreaming of his picana, I was finally claiming something for myself. It was a raw encounter, born from a crude bet, but in that moment, it felt like the most honest thing I had ever done. The debt was paid, and the prize was that high point, that instant when the world disappeared and I could forget who I was supposed to be, and finally, just be. Leaving his apartment was harder than entering. The door closed with a soft click, leaving us on opposite sides of a newly created universe. The hallway now felt like a walk of shame, lit by that same cold light, but it wasn't shame that I felt, it was difference. I was someone else. My body moved differently, carrying both the weight and the lightness of a secret that was mine alone. I opened the door to my apartment, and the smell of the dead party hit me in the stomach. The sour mix of beer, cold grease, and disappointment. And there he was, Zeca was in the same spot, in the same position, a monument to mediocrity. The sight of him, so pathetic and utterly oblivious, filled me with a cold, cutting contempt. For the first time, it wasn't anger or frustration, it was pity. A profound pity that he would never know, never understand. I had crossed the universe and back, and he hadn't even changed the channel in his own oblivion. I went to our bedroom in silence. I stripped off the clothes that felt like they belonged to another woman and stepped into the shower. I let the hot water run over me, washing the scent of another man from my skin, but I knew it was useless. His memory wasn't on the surface, it was embedded in my soul, and that was a stain I had no intention of ever washing away. The next morning was surreal. I woke before he did, the sunlight flooding the room as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just been turned on its axis. For a moment, lying there, the normality of it all felt like a fragile disguise. Zeca woke up hungover, his head pounding, groaning like a child. He found me in the kitchen, making coffee, the familiar aroma filling the air. "We won, didn't we, my love?" he said, his voice hoarse, planting a loud kiss on my cheek that tasted of stale coffee and a poorly slept night. "Did you see Claudia's face? Priceless. That steak is going to be the best damn steak of the year." He laughed, genuinely proud of his grand strategy, reliving the glory of his bet. I turned and smiled back. A slow, controlled smile. A Mona Lisa smile that betrayed nothing. "It certainly was," I said, my own calmness surprising me. He had no idea of the scale of his victory or of its true cost. Looking at him so childish, so blind, filled me with a sense of power that was almost cruel. I held a secret that diminished him, that turned him into my own private joke, and that secret, mine alone, was delicious. The coffee tasted the same as it always did, but there was a new taste in my mouth, the taste of power. Later that day, the universe decided to test my nerve. Zeca and I were riding down in the elevator, in a silence that was comfortable for him, but electric for me. The doors opened on our floor, and fate stepped in. Ricardo and Claudia. The space seemed to shrink. The air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. The silence that fell was weighted with everything that could not be said. Claudia's eyes burned into me, filled with a pure, impotent hatred. I held her gaze, my own as cold as ice. Zeca, oblivious to it all, just smiled and cracked a joke to break the ice that only he couldn't feel. "So, neighbor," he boomed, his voice painfully childish, "ready to pay up for that steak?" Before Ricardo could answer, his eyes met mine. It lasted only a second, a single heartbeat. But in that 1 second, we exchanged everything. The memory of the night before, the complicity of a perfect crime, and the promise that this was not the end. It was the beginning of a new game. A silent, far more dangerous game, played right under their noses. Zeca had won his stupid bet, but he had no idea that I had just wagered my entire life, and I had no intention of losing. Zeca's bet was for a piece of meat. Mine was for a piece of my soul. He won a barbecue. I won the right to finally taste my own life, even if it tasted of danger. And in the end, some prizes are worth any price.